this is the 7th idea forum that we've had since we began the retooling of the BGA a few years ago. We have held these all over the city and suburbs because one of the things that we have to do as an organization is to encourage discussion of important public issues. This is a city in which we've rushed through too many public policy decisions without due diligence, without thinking about consequences. You may have heard of a parking privatization deal. Perfect example. So what we've been doing over these couple of years is we've taken important public policy issues from term limits to privatization to TIFs to the gaming bill to townships and now pensions. And this is actually our second pension forum in just a month. And the reason for that is quite simple. When we did our first pension forum a month ago, laying out the issues and talking about some of the concerns to get it right, but not to get it unfairly right, or what is right, and whether it should be part of a larger solution or by itself, we realized that the missing piece in that first forum is that there are some really interesting proposals on the table. Now, when we had the first forum, Governor Quinn had not proposed his pension reform plan. Since then, he has a plan on the table. Speaker Madigan says pension reform is his top priority this month. The Cook County Board and its commissioners have spent a lot of time and effort trying to formulate a plan of their own because they have their own crisis to deal with. Mayor Emanuel has his own sense of how this all ought to come out, borrowed heavily from what they did in Rhode Island. But he's laying low publicly for the time being, understanding that it has to start at the state level. There are a lot of balls in the air. This is one of those moments we haven't seen in many years. Someone told me about a week ago that lawmakers, when it comes to pensions and perhaps Medicaid and a couple of other issues, are either going to get it right this time or we lose a generation of opportunity. In other words, this is one of those moments when there seems to be a real feeling everywhere that pension reform is necessary. Before we begin the panel, let me just make it very clear. We do not have a specific BGA plan. We don't say, do it this way, don't do it this way. Here's what we say. Pension abuse, as it's been practiced in Illinois, is not only intolerable, it's reprehensible. And pension abuse has mainly benefited the insiders. Pension abuse has been used to game the system by the people with access to it, not rank-and-file workers. So it's very important to realize, whether you believe it or not, and a lot of people don't, that this isn't us siding up against unions, against workers. We believe that everybody who works in the public sector is entitled to a fair and decent pension. The problem is that the politicians who are responsible for providing us with a well-funded, safe and secure system have failed in their obligation. So where we are today is in a situation where we either solve the problem with shared sacrifice or we don't solve it at all. You can't simply say, raise everybody's taxes by 2 or 3 times, because that puts the burden on taxpayers. Now, unfortunately, the people who created the problem, the politicians, are the ones who are not going to have to pay for it or suffer for it. Although I would argue that from a civic standpoint, each of them should take double the hit of anyone else as we pass a plan. But that won't be on the table. Suffice it to say that all we want is, we want an end to pension abuse, and we want some sort of plan that will save the system and guarantee retirement security for the hardworking men and women who paid into the system believing that they would be assured of a decent retirement. They will have to sacrifice, there's no doubt about it, because you can't solve the problem without that. And they can be mad at the politicians with darn good reason. But what we're doing tonight is trying to look at some of the things that people already have in motion to solve these problems. And I think the potential is to be very, very enlightening and informative as we are at this watershed moment where we could actually have something resembling real pension reform this month in Springfield. So with that, let me give it to Bob Reed. And Bob, we've got a great panel, and we'll have the second panel, the second pension discussion, hopefully leave here a little better informed about options and opportunities.
Let me introduce our pension panel for tonight and our group of experts, beginning with the Honorable Bridget Gaynor, 10th District Cook County Commissioner. Bridget started out as a community organizer for more than 7 years in both New York and Chicago. She's worked for the City of Chicago in the Budget Department and as the Director of Lakefront Parks at the Park District. Prior to becoming a commissioner, she spent 8 years with Aon, the insurance giant. She holds an MBA from the University of Chicago and lately has been taking the point on the public pension situation for Cook County. Laurence Msall of the Civic Federation. Laurence Msall has been president of the Civic Federation since 2002, and before joining the Civic Federation, he was the senior advisor for economic development for Illinois Governor George Ryan, and prior to that, working on the governor's staff. He also was vice president of the Commercial Club of Chicago and assistant to the director of the Illinois Department of Commerce and Community Affairs, and he is a licensed attorney and a graduate of Loyola University School of Law. Hank, was that you?
No, I'm going to make sure it's not.
Allow me to introduce Hank Scheff, who's with AFSCME Council 31. Hank is the Director of Research and Employee Benefits for AFSCME Council 31. He advises union leadership and staff on all matters pertaining to employee benefits. He served 2 terms as the elected participants representative of the AFSCME Employees Pension Plan, and he was also appointed by Speaker Madigan as a public member of the Illinois Pension Laws Commission from 1995 through 2002, and served on the Advisory Commission on Pension Benefits, which was created by the Senate. And he is a graduate of Grinnell College. And finally, Ralph Martire, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. He teaches master's level classes on fiscal policy at the University of Illinois and right here at Roosevelt University, where he is a distinguished lecturer on public policy. In 2011, he was appointed to serve on the U.S. Department of Education, Equity, and Excellence Commission. And he also holds a JD from University of Michigan, and I guess we say go blue, right? So let's begin, if we can. You can just keep your phones on if you want to answer them. It's all right. This is a sophisticated audience. Pretty much know what's going on, but let me ask the question here that keeps popping up. There is an $80 billion underfunding of the state pensions, we're told, and if you lay the city and the county over that, it could be over $100 billion. That's if all those obligations came due at once, which is not going to happen. But let me ask the panel, starting with Commissioner Gaynor, why is underfunding a problem?
So why is underfunding a problem, or why do we need to have a well-funded pension system? Underfunding?
Take it away, it's all yours.
Well, I mean, underfunding is a problem when you get to the point that, when you look at the county funds, 30% of what goes into the fund every year is from the employer contribution and the employee contribution. 70% of what goes into the fund as income comes from the investment returns. So if you get to a point where you're only 50% funded, or in some cases of other public funds, police and fire funds of the city, you're less than that, you start to degrade your ability to stay solvent because the whole plan is set up on a majority of the income coming from investment returns, which means you have to increase employer and employee contributions or change benefits. So obviously we want to stay solvent. It seems you don't want to run a system that is not viable. And in order to be viable, you have to have a reasonable expectation to be able to pay benefits. You need to have a well-funded pension system because the occupations that are funded in the pension, whose retirement are funded through there, are extremely vital to the operation of our city and our county. I mean, you have to have a well-run jail, you have to have a public health system, property tax system. All of those occupations are incumbent upon having a retirement system. That was the expectation of the workforce, and that's the type of thing that we need to see going forward. So I'll keep it brief, but those are my 2 initial thoughts.
Hank, give us your thoughts about that.
I'd be happy to. It's a pleasure serving on this distinguished panel. I've worked with all of these people over many years. I was on Ralph's board for some 10 years. I've been on too many panels to count with Laurence. And Bridget and I served 24 roughly very pleasurable months as technical advisors to Mayor Daley's commission to strengthen Chicago's pensions. So we're familiar with all these folks. A proper funded pension system in the public or private sector really is kind of it's a moral imperative, and I would say it's a fiscal imperative too. What are retirement benefits? They're deferred compensation earned by employees as they do the work through their work life to fund their retirement. So when they reach the years where they can retire under the rules of the pension plan is supposed to have the money. And if the pension plan isn't funded in the public sector, then some future generation is going to be paying the costs of the pensions that were earned by the prior generation, and that's not correct. And you may not believe this, but in other parts of the country outside of Illinois, and in one place in Illinois, the public officials understand this, and they fund the pensions properly based on sound actuarial standards. So typically in most other states and in Illinois, the shining example is the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. They fund the pensions based on what the actuaries, the independent actuaries who are hired by the fund, by the trustees who have a fiduciary duty to get this right. They tell the 3,000 IMRF, Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund employers how much they owe, and they pay it. And if the employers don't pay it, then the IMRF can actually grab the money as it flows from the state to the IMRF. And as a consequence, the IMRF was essentially 100% funded in 2007 before the market meltdown. And like every pension fund in the country, public and private and individual account, they suffered huge hits in that market meltdown, down to probably close to 70%, and now they're approximately 84% funded, and on the way back to 100. And we don't talk much about the funding crisis of the IMRF because there isn't one. So it's a moral imperative to have adequately fund pensions, and I would explain to you all in terms you can understand that it's actually a fiscal imperative as well. You can either pay compounded interest, which is what we're doing right now when we have underfunded pensions, or you can earn compounded interest. And it should be elemental to all of you. It's much better to earn it than to pay it. And just as you're faced as a homeowner with your credit card bills with the truth that it is cheaper when you are carrying a big debt to suck it up and pay it off quickly as opposed to letting it fester. If you can take the long run, you will know that even though that costs you more up front, it costs you less over the life of paying back the loan. So how did I fund my kids' college education? In part by refinancing my house with a balloon mortgage, and I disciplined paying it off in 7 more years. It took me about 14 years to pay off the house. When my first kid got to college, I had cash flow. And you know what? Under the financial aid forms, I didn't get penalized for paying it off early. They assumed I was paying the right thing. So the point here is that the right thing to do is to pay it off quickly. The problem is, and Ralph will go into this in much greater detail, we can't pay it off quickly.
Yeah,
in Illinois and Chicago because we have a structural deficit, and we can't pay for government that we want right now, much less catch up on the pension funds.
Yeah, we will talk about that and get into that. But Laurence, I'd like you to address the issue of the underfunding. And also we talked about a moral and financial imperative. How do you see it?
I would agree with both Bridget and Hank in terms of the importance of funding. Clearly, the reason why funding is important is because it makes that retirement benefit affordable for the government and for the participants. Hank pointed out that we're rather unique in Illinois in that we only have one fund, the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, that has a steady actuarial-based funding requirement with what I call the hammer on top, so that if the municipality doesn't make their contribution, they risk the intercept of the other state funds that they would be receiving. So in terms of the moral imperative, as Hank said, there's generational equity issues. We shouldn't be getting services from our government that we're going to push off on our children or grandchildren. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we've done. The uniqueness of Illinois, especially when we talk about the city of Chicago and Cook County's pension funds, is that the crazy financial schemes that the state created for themselves have been brought to the county and the city. And so instead of having, as they do in the private sector or as in most other states, having the actuaries announce what the cost of the program is that year, so that you pay the normal cost and a portion of the unfunded to get up to 100% funded. Illinois has created avoidance techniques, financial and accounting gimmicks, 50-year plans, statutory multipliers that allow units of government to underfund their pensions. Now, as a result, most of the city and county pension funds are closer to insolvency than they are solvency. So that's why funding of your pensions is important.
Ralph, you want to take a crack at that? And tell us why you think that the funding and the underfunding is such a crucial issue and why it's gotten us into this mess.
Well, thanks for having me here. Sure. Well, first of all, I'm just going to agree with what everyone just said, and so I'm going to depart a little and say, all right, it is an important issue, but you can't understand the issue until you look at what caused the problem and the underfunding in the first place. I think anyone wants to solve a problem, you have to understand really what caused the problem first. And if you look at the Illinois systems and you look at the benefit structures and you look at the normal cost, that is what you have to pay for current workers, you can see that that is not the driving problem. In fact, we don't have a pension problem. We truly do have a funding problem. We have a state government and more recently local governments that just haven't put in their required employer contributions. So at the state level, this practice has been going on for at least 40 years. And what that effectively has done is for taxpayers, for 40 years, the cost of the public services the state does deliver to us, education, health, human services, and public safety being 9 out of $10, the cost of those services has been subsidized by our pension funds. We as taxpayers didn't have to pay for them at full cost for 40 years because the state borrowed against the pension system to help subsidize the cost of services. So if we're calling this pension debt, but it's truly debt, and if we could borrow this money from a bank to fund current services, I think our focus on the solution side would be more about, gee, how do we find a rational repayment structure and revenue source to cover the debt that we rightfully owe, rather than saying, hey, maybe we ought to make the bank's workers cover the cost of our debt that we incurred to the bank over the last 40 years. But because we call it pension debt, I think we focus a lot on the wrong end of the spectrum, and we forget, quite frankly, that the underfunding of the pension system is primarily driven by the state not making its employer contribution, has actually subsidized the cost of delivery of current services to us. Now, at the county level, I think Laurence raised a great point, but it needs to be really emphasized. And at the city level, these statutory contribution rates that have been set up for the county and the city, they basically say, look, 2 years past what the employee contribution was, multiply it by some number, and that's what the current employer contribution is. It's not at all tied into any actuarial anything anywhere. Moreover, if you then don't get investment returns that you're counting on in your system, there's no mechanism within the statutory funding formula to allow you to cover the investment loss over a period of time like the IRMF has. So when the IMRF took this big hit, like everybody did during the Great Recession, it didn't have to put all that money in 1 year. It had 5 years to smooth out and get back to where it should have been. There's no such mechanism in either the Cook County or the city system. It's just a very flawed statutory formula, not at all tied to actuarial realities. And then you look a little deeper just on the county system. In 1991, the county government decided to assign to the pension system the responsibility to cover retiree health care costs. No wonder out of county government's general revenue. Now it's got to be funded by the pension system. Didn't give it a revenue source to cover it, just put this added obligation on the pension system. The state, in its infinite wisdom to save a little bit of dollars in operating revenue going forward, passed a number of early retirement programs, allowing people to retire before they otherwise could have at a higher benefit level. Didn't fund any of that. That's a double whammy for Cook County and the city, because now they know those two employers no longer have those workers staying in and making their contributions, and they have to pay them a bigger pension than what they would have otherwise.
Okay, so I think we're getting the message that they shorted the system and that there's a lot going on there. So let's jump ahead here now. So we have a problem, it's underfunded. We got into this fix through a combination of delinquency on the part of our public servants, Does anyone want to take a stab at, did we overpromise in terms of benefits as well? Laurence?
Whether we overpromised or not, by not tying the actuarial cost of the program and not demanding that we fund the full cost of the program each year, we in effect were making the promise less likely that it would be kept. And so the benefits for public employees are different than most people in the private sector currently have. We have a defined benefit program for most government, for almost all government employees in Illinois and in Chicago. And the private sector has moved significantly away from defined benefits because of the risk associated with trying to predict what the cost is going to be to have that rate of investment. And when you underfund the pensions, you generate the demand for greater returns, which can also lead to greater risk. You know, the debate about the, you know, whether we overpromised or not, we overpromised everyone, basically, whether it was just the government employees, the people receiving the services to the state, or the services of the city. The problem and the challenge is, what do we do now? Because we could focus on, as Ralph said, what caused the problem, and we can reach an agreement very quickly. We all reached agreement that underfunding was a big factor in causing this problem. Where do you get the money to reverse underfunding? How do you make that a priority? That is a much more significant question rather than whether the promises were overpromised.